The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the quiet of a machine at rest, but the hollow metallic silence of a machine that has run out of purpose. It's a German Tiger tank, one of the most feared weapons of the Second World War, abandoned in a French field in the summer of 1944. Its 88mm gun is still pointed west, but its engine is cold. The ground around it is churned to mud, not by combat, but by its own desperate final attempts to move. It wasn't destroyed by a Sherman or a fighter bomber. It was simply left. The crew walked away. This 70-ton monument to industrial terror became a static hulk, because the system behind it could no longer deliver the one thing its complexity demanded: fuel. This is the energy historian, uncovering the hidden systems that power civilization. We are taught that wars are won by courage, strategy, and industrial output. Tanks roll off production lines, ships are launched, planes are built. The side with the most stuff wins, but that's only the visible half of the equation. The other half is movement. And movement, on the industrial scale of modern war, is a physics problem with a single, unforgiving variable: energy density. You can have all the tanks in the world, but if you can't move them 300 miles to the front, at speed, under fire, they are just very expensive fixed fortifications. The Second World War was the first truly mechanized war, a conflict fought not just with machines, but by machines, and every machine had an insatiable thirst. Consider the arithmetic of invasion. The D-Day landings in June 1944 were the most complex logistical operation in human history. The plan wasn't just to put men on a beach, it was to keep them moving. The Allied blueprint called for landing over 150,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and 5,300 other vehicles in the first 24 hours. But the real challenge began after the beachhead was secure. To break out of Normandy and race across France, General Patton's Third Army alone would need 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. A single armored division on the advance consumed roughly 2,500 gallons of gasoline every hour. This wasn't a supply chain, it was a liquid lifeline, stretched taut across the English Channel. So the Allies built an infrastructure miracle. They brought their own ports, the artificial Mulberry Harbours, because the Germans held the real ones. And when those weren't enough, they built a pipeline. Not a metaphorical one. A physical inch-thick steel pipe laid across the bed of the English Channel from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. They called it Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. It could pump 1 million gallons of fuel a day directly to the front, invisible to bombers. But Pluto was just the trunk line. From the coast, the fuel had to travel in trucks, in jerrycans, in anything that could move. The famous Red Ball Express was an entire army of nearly 6,000 trucks driving around the clock on a dedicated highway, just to keep the spearhead tanks fueled. The entire offensive moved at the speed of a gasoline truck. Now, flip the perspective. Look east. The German war machine in 1944 was a masterpiece of tactical engineering and a catastrophe of strategic logistics. They had designed weapons for performance, not for efficiency. The Tiger tank was a rolling monument to this philosophy. Its massive armor and powerful gun made it nearly invincible head-on. But its Maybach 512 engine was a fuel-hungry beast. A Tiger consumed roughly 1 gallon of gasoline for every half-mile it traveled. A full 116-gallon tank gave it a combat range of less than 75 miles. For comparison, the American Sherman tank could go over 150 miles on a single tank. This wasn't a minor difference. It was a structural flaw in the entire German theory of warfare. The German military had gone to war in 1939 with a brilliant, terrifying doctrine: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The idea was to use concentrated armor and air power to punch through enemy lines so fast they couldn't react. It worked spectacularly in Poland and France, where distances were short and the enemy was unprepared. But Blitzkrieg had a hidden, voracious appetite. It was a strategy built on momentum, and momentum requires constant, massive fuel injection. Germany had a problem. It had very little oil of its own. Its pre-war economy ran on synthetic fuel, painstakingly manufactured from coal in massive chemical plants like the Lohner Works. By 1943, these synthetic plants supplied over 90% of Germany's aviation fuel and half its total liquid fuel. The entire Nazi war effort was literally built on coal. This created a terrifying dependency. The synthetic fuel plants were enormous, fixed, and incredibly vulnerable to bombing. And in the spring of 1944, the Allies finally took aim at them. Operation Point Blank and the later oil campaign targeted this precise fragility. The US 8th Air Force and the British RAF began a systematic bombing campaign against the hydrogenation plants. The results were immediate and catastrophic for Germany. In May 1944, German synthetic fuel production hit a peak of 850,000 tons. After a month of sustained bombing, it was halved. By September, it was down to 180,000 tons. The machine was being bled dry. This is where the tactical genius of the German army collided with the arithmetic of energy. In the desperate months after D-Day, German commanders like Field Marshal von Kluge and later Model repeatedly had to make impossible choices. They had panzer divisions in reserve, but moving them to counter an Allied breakthrough required allocating precious train cars of fuel. Offensives were planned not around strategic objectives, but around fuel dumps. The famous counterattack at Mortain in August 1944, meant to cut off the American breakout, was launched with only enough gasoline for the tanks to reach their objective. There was no fuel allocated for the return trip, or for exploitation. It was a suicide mission by logistics. When the attack stalled, the Panthers and Tigers were abandoned where they ran dry. The Eastern Front told the same story, but on a continental scale. The 1942 German drive for the Caucasus was fundamentally a campaign for oil. When it failed at Stalingrad, the strategic initiative was lost. From that point on, the German army was in a slow, grinding retreat, constantly constrained by a shrinking fuel ration. Tanks were dug in as static pillboxes because there was no fuel to maneuver them. Elite units were immobilized. The Luftwaffe had cutting-edge jet fighters by 1944, like the Me-262, but they sat on airfields because there was no high-octane aviation fuel for them. The machine was still producing advanced weapons, but the lifeblood to use them was gone. This is the counterintuitive heart of the matter. We look at a lost war and see a collapse of armies, a failure of will, a decisive battle. But often, the battle is just the final symptom. The real failure happens earlier, in the silent industrial systems that convert raw materials into motion. Germany didn't simply lose the war on the battlefield. It ran out of the physical ability to project force. Its military machine became a victim of its own design, too complex, too thirsty, and tied to a supply chain that was both fragile and irreplaceable. The Allies didn't just have more tanks, they had a system designed for fuel efficiency and, more importantly, they controlled the global spigot. American production wasn't just about building Shermans, it was about building tankers, pipelines, and refineries at a scale that turned fuel from a constraint into a weapon. The transition from coal to oil in the 20th century didn't just change economies, it redefined the geometry of power. Coal-powered navies had to hug coaling stations. Oil-powered fleets could range globally. But that freedom came with a new vulnerability: the tanker, the pipeline, the refinery. The side that could protect its energy logistics could keep moving. The side that could not froze in place. In modern warfare, mobility is sovereignty, and mobility is purchased with fuel. This pattern isn't confined to 1944. It's a recurring script in industrial conflict. The 1973 Yom Kippur War saw initial Arab successes stall not just by Israeli resistance, but because advancing tank columns outran their fuel trucks, a mistake the Israeli military had learned in previous wars. Even in the digital age, the principle holds. A modern armored brigade combat team can consume over 50,000 gallons of fuel per day at rest. In combat, that figure can double. The US military in Iraq and Afghanistan found that up to 70% of its convoy traffic was dedicated solely to hauling fuel and water. The enemy quickly learned that attacking a fuel truck was far more effective than attacking a tank. So the real question shifts. It's not about who has the most advanced weapons. It's about Who can sustain the energy flow to make those weapons meaningful across time and distance? The battlefield is the endpoint of a vast, invisible pipeline of energy conversion. When that pipeline is cut, the most powerful army in the world becomes a collection of expensive, stationary objects. Victory doesn't just go to the strong, it goes to the mobile. And in an industrial world, mobility is a liquid. If this changed how you see the forces that shape history, consider subscribing. The hidden infrastructure is always there. Now you know where to look.